The cuffs bit deep into his wrists, metal cold against skin still warm from sleep, as two men in black shirts with fake badges whispered codes only soldiers should know. A German shepherd snarled behind the door, neighbors filmed from shadowed porches, and somewhere in the dark, a safe full of stolen power waited to be opened. Before we begin, like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The knock wasn't a knock. It was a pounding so deliberate that it seemed to pull the night in closer. 3 sharp hits, a pause, then 2 more. The kind that makes your heartbeat decide if it should speed up or slow down. 2 figures filled the doorway, black shirts stretched tight over broad shoulders, badges that caught the porch light but didn't shine like they should. Their eyes didn't wander. They locked onto their target like they'd been told exactly where to look. The taller one spoke first, voice calm enough to be dangerous, saying there'd been a violation, a curfew broken, fines unpaid. Behind the door, a low growl rose from deep in the chest of a German shepherd, not loud enough to threaten, just steady enough to promise that teeth were ready. Neighbors were shadows behind curtains, but their phones were glowing. Every second, more screens lit up, recording everything. The man on the porch didn't argue. He didn't plead. He held his wrists out, letting the cuffs click shut, the metal biting skin without resistance. A small smirk touched the corner of his mouth, the kind that comes when you've already thought 5 moves ahead. The one with the clipboard shifted, revealing the crooked stamp of a township seal, close enough to look real to anyone who didn't know how to read it. To anyone but him. The cuffs were too tight, but he didn't flinch. He watched their hands instead. The taller one's knuckles bore scars that weren't from desk work. The other's shirt outlined the unmistakable shape of a concealed holster. This wasn't neighborhood watch. This was something else. The kind of something that made you wonder how many other doors they'd knocked on before this one. As they moved him toward the steps, his eyes flicked for just a moment toward the mailbox. Inside, hidden under flyers and junk mail, was a small black drive no bigger than a thumb. And up in the eave above the porch, a pinhole mic silently caught every word being said. He'd placed them both there hours earlier, as if he'd known the night was coming. The shorter one muttered into his shoulder mic, and that's when it happened. A code. Not a police code. Not a civilian one. A sequence of numbers and words that didn't belong here, on this street, in this life. It was the kind of code you only heard overseas, the kind used in places where silence could save a life or end it. It froze him, not with fear, but with recognition. For a split second, their eyes met, and something passed between them. The guard didn't know it, but he'd just given away the truth. And the man in cuffs knew exactly what it meant. He wasn't dealing with petty HOA thugs playing dress-up. He was staring at men who had been trained by someone he used to know. What kind of neighborhood hires men like that? And more importantly, who gave them the right to be here? He hadn't moved back here to fight battles. That was the deal he made with himself when he left the uniform behind. A quiet street, a worn porch swing, and a promise to his sister that he'd spend his days fixing fences, not breaking through them. The HOA promised safety, community, a place where people waved instead of stared. They delivered something else entirely. 2 months in, the first letter came. A warning about his porch light being too bright. Then it was the flag bracket, suddenly declared non-compliant. Then the patrol car, if you could call it that, creeping through the cul-de-sac at night with no plates, no markings, just 2 silhouettes staring straight ahead. Every rule they made felt less like order and more like control. Next door, Mia was 16, all energy and sharp questions, never without her small drone buzzing above the rooftops. She flew it like an artist, capturing angles no one else thought to see. Her grandmother, frail and stubborn, lived on oxygen and refused to leave the house she'd owned for 40 years. She couldn't afford the compliance fines that showed up monthly, each one more absurd than the last. The board held its meetings late, too late for any working neighbor to attend. Changes slipped into the bylaws at midnight, pages rewritten without signatures, whole paragraphs copied and pasted from who knew where. He'd seen one of their seals once, the impression pressed into the paper just wrong enough to make his skin tighten. Later, he learned it came from a former city clerk now consulting for the HOA. He tried to ignore it, told himself it wasn't his fight. But then one evening, his phone buzzed with a text from Mia, just a single image from her drone footage. 2 of the so-called HOA police standing behind the clubhouse, the taller one shaking hands with a man in a gray suit. An envelope changed hands. The man turned just enough for the camera to catch his face. Recognition slammed into him like a punch. Years ago, in another country, under another flag, he'd seen that man walking out of a compound that was supposed to be empty. An independent contractor, the kind who took jobs no government would admit existed. A man who was on a very short list of people you never wanted to see twice in one lifetime. The thought burned in his chest. What was a private operator doing in a neighborhood like this? And why was he paying the HOA's enforcers in cash? Mia's follow-up message was short, almost casual, but he could see the urgency behind her words. She'd been flying low, close enough to pick up the audio. She hadn't caught every word, but the ones she did made his blood run cold. Numbers, dates, and something about locking down properties before the quarter ends. His sister asked him at dinner if he was okay. He just nodded, chewing too long, staring at the clock like it had betrayed him. Every instinct told him to step in, but the rational voice in his head warned him about what stepping in would cost. Still, the image stayed burned into his mind. The handshake, the envelope, the face of a man who didn't belong here. The kind of man who only showed up when something bigger, much bigger, was in motion. If the HOA was just a board of neighbors, why were they working with someone like him? And if this was about fines, why did it suddenly feel like it was about something far more dangerous? The notice said the meeting was open to all residents. That was the first lie of the night. When he walked through the door, the air shifted. 3 people sat behind a table, each wearing the kind of smile that was too polite to be real. 7 chairs lined the wall for residents, but only 2 were occupied, both by people who didn't look like they came to ask questions. The chairwoman cleared her throat and announced a new rule before he'd even taken a seat. Effective immediately, no recording devices allowed inside the clubhouse. The man beside her glanced toward his ear, adjusting an earpiece. He heard the static pop of a comm channel, followed by short bursts of numbers and phrases that had no place in a neighborhood meeting. They moved through the agenda like it was a script, eyes skipping over anything that might spark debate. Then came the security update. The captain, though no one had introduced him as such, leaned forward, resting both hands on the table, and laid out a new enforcement clause. It gave them the right to detain residents for vendor access violations. The words dripped with authority they didn't have, designed to sound like law to anyone who didn't know better. Luis, a single father sitting 2 seats away, raised his hand. His voice shook as he explained that he'd been fined 3 times in 2 weeks for having his work van parked in his own driveway. He'd asked for an extension, just until the end of the month. The captain's response was a slow smirk, his fingers tapping the shape of the sidearm under his shirt as he repeated, "Policy is policy." The tension snapped, but not with yelling. It was the kind of silence that weighed on everyone at once, making the air feel heavier. He didn't argue. He just watched, memorizing the faces, the inflections, the little tells people can't hide when they're enjoying the power they shouldn't have. Halfway through the meeting, his phone buzzed. Mia's name lit the screen, followed by a single message. "You need to see this now." He slid the phone under the table and tapped the link. A live feed filled the screen. Mia's drone was inside their back office. It hovered low, silent, facing a desk where 2 of the HOA enforcers stood with the safe door wide open. Inside was a stack of county-issued citation books, their blue covers and embossed seals impossible to mistake. Each one bore a government serial number, and each one should have been locked inside the county office, not here in the hands of a private HOA. One of the men flipped through a book casually, like a magazine, stopping to point at a page. The other scribbled something onto a separate pad, an address, a name, something that looked a lot like a property description. His chest tightened. This wasn't just intimidation. This was organized, deliberate, and sanctioned by someone far above the board. County-issued materials didn't walk out of government storage on their own. Someone on the inside had handed them over. He locked eyes with the captain across the room. The man's expression hadn't changed, but in the space between blinks, it was as if they both knew the game had shifted. He had proof now, proof that could bury them if he survived long enough to use it. The chairwoman tapped the gavel, ending the meeting with a too bright smile. But the buzz of coded chatter in the captain's earpiece told a different story. And as he stepped out into the night, phone still in his palm, the only thought in his mind was how deep this rot went, and how far they'd go to keep it hidden. The numbers didn't lie. The serials stamped into those citation books matched a batch the county had reported missing 6 months ago. He'd memorized enough of them from the drone feed to confirm it in minutes. Stolen government authority, sitting in the hands of men who had no badge, no oath, and no right. That wasn't just corruption, it was a declaration. An envelope slid under his door that evening, no return address. Inside, a folded page torn from a bench notebook. The handwriting was tight and deliberate. It was Judge Keegan, 3 houses down, a man who'd spent 30 years handing down verdicts without bending once. He'd written the statute number for impersonating a public officer, underlined twice. His hands might have trembled when he wrote it, but the ink was sharp. Keegan was too old to fight, but he still knew the law better than anyone in the county. He'd heard whispers, seen the patrols. Now, seeing those citation books on his street, he knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just illegal. It was a move to control property, to bleed people dry and take their homes one fine at a time. He didn't call the police. He called the sheriff, a man who still wore his badge like it meant something. The sheriff's voice was flat when he heard the story, like someone who'd been waiting years for this call. He'd had rumors before, even complaints, but never proof. Now he had both. The plan was simple on paper. The sheriff would park 2 blocks away, watch the street, wait for the moment they crossed the line in public view. No jurisdiction games, no technicalities. They'd be caught in the act. But there was nothing simple about waiting. Because when people like this, since you've seen too much, they don't wait for your next move. It happened faster than expected. A noise outside, a car stopping too quickly, boots on concrete, then the crash of a neighbor's window shattering. One of the HOA enforcers had swung a baton through the glass, calling it a warning. The sound ripped through the street, dragging people to their porches in stunned silence. Inside his house, the dog barked so hard the walls seemed to vibrate. His sister's voice cut through the noise, telling him to stay back, but he was already moving. They didn't knock this time. They surrounded the house, 3 in front, 2 in the yard, 1 by the back fence. Hands hovered near holsters, eyes scanning like they were clearing a building. One of them barked in order to open the door. The words were clean, clipped, military clipped. Across the street, porch lights flickered on. Neighbors stood frozen, phones raised, unsure if they were filming a crime or about to watch one. In the distance, the low hum of an engine eased closer. The sheriff's cruiser, no lights, no siren, just a slow, deliberate approach. The timing would decide everything. If the HOA's fake police moved first, the law wouldn't be enough to stop them. And if the sheriff didn't step in now, this wouldn't be an arrest, it would be a raid. The first shot wasn't aimed at anyone. It punched the night open, a single deafening crack that scattered birds and froze the entire street. One of the guards fired into the air, grinning like chaos was a joke only he understood. People ducked behind railings, phones trembling in their hands. Children's faces glowed in the light of their parents' screens, watching in wide-eyed confusion as the men in black turned their neighborhood into a war zone. He stepped forward before the panic could swallow the moment. No flinch, no hesitation, just a measured pace toward the one holding the gun. His wrists were still cuffed, but they wouldn't be for long. A sharp twist, a pull against the iron porch post, and the chain snapped with a sound that cut sharper than the gunshot had. The guard's smirk faltered. The captain reached for him, but his grab was met with a sudden shift. A move so precise it left no doubt this wasn't luck. The captain's arm was redirected, his balance stolen in an instant, and then he was pinned. Not a strike, not a bruise, just control. The kind of control that says you could end this, but you choose not to. Years of training condensed into seconds, not to hurt, but to stop the hurt from spreading. Behind him, his sister's voice cracked, telling him to get inside. The dog's bark was frantic, claws scraping at the door. Mia's voice carried from somewhere to his left, choked with fear, but steady enough to tell him she was still filming. Luis stood frozen on his porch, his son gripping his hand so tightly their knuckles turned white. Then the sheriff's headlights lit the street. The cruiser rolled to a stop, and the man in uniform stepped out with a weight that silenced even the most reckless. His eyes went straight to the captain, then to the clipboard with its crooked seal. He didn't need an explanation. Judge Keegan stepped forward from the shadows, his cane tapping once against the pavement. His voice was thin, but it carried. He spoke the statute number like it was a sentence being handed down in court. The sheriff nodded once, like a gavel hitting wood. The captain didn't look shaken. In fact, he smiled. A slow, mocking grin that spread wider as he spoke. He said the board was just a face. That if the money trail ever came to light, the people it led to would make tonight look like a warm-up. Bigger men, bigger reach, bigger power. The words landed heavy. Not a bluff, not a threat. A promise. Somewhere behind him, a neighbor whispered if this was over. But the truth was written across the captain's face. It wasn't. And now the question wasn't just who gave them the authority to run this street. It was who they really worked for. The ledger didn't just tell a story, it screamed it. Pages of numbers, names, and addresses, each one tied to a fine, a lien, a foreclosure. It was a machine, designed to bleed people until they had nothing left but the keys to their homes. And those keys? They went straight to a shell company that paid the board under the table. Dues weren't funding landscaping or safety. They were funding theft. He read through the columns and felt the weight of every name. Families barely making it. Retirees who'd worked their whole lives for a paid-off home. Single parents like Luis, targeted because they couldn't fight back. The sick, the elderly, the ones least able to push against the current. That's who they'd gone after first. The youngest guard, Evan, hovered at the edge of the chaos, his grip on his rifle slack. His eyes didn't hold the cold confidence of the others. They held something closer to shame. When their gazes met, Evan looked away, then back again, like he'd just made a decision he couldn't undo. He stepped forward, pulled the magazine from his weapon, and dropped it to the ground. His voice cracked when he said he hadn't signed up for this, that his mother's medical debt had driven him into their ranks, and now he couldn't look her in the eye. The captain snarled at him, but the sound was swallowed by the street erupting in light. Porch after porch flicked on like a fuse being lit. Neighbors stepped out, not with weapons, not to fight, but to witness. Phones raised, faces steady. The fear that had kept them inside for months broke in an instant. The enforcers weren't faceless anymore. They were surrounded by the people they'd been preying on. In the middle of it all, he turned to the crowd. If you believe neighborhoods should protect their weakest, then don't let this get buried. Share it. Let every street in the county see exactly what happens when power gets handed to the wrong hands. Because silence is what they counted on, and silence is what we just broke. The sheriff moved in, cuffs snapping onto the captain's wrists. For the first time all night, the man didn't smile. But the chairwoman did. She stepped forward, eyes locked on him, and in her hand was a folded sheet of paper. She opened it slowly, revealing an official court order, stamped and signed. The name on it was Judge Keegan's. Only it wasn't. Keegan took one look and shook his head, his face pale. The signature was his, but he'd never signed it. The stamp was real. The document was real. But it was a forgery so perfect it could have stood up in court. The chairwoman leaned in, her voice low enough for only him to hear. This goes deeper than your sheriff. Deeper than your law. And if you keep pulling, you won't like what you find. The captain was loaded into the cruiser. Evan stood apart, weaponless, eyes down. The street was quiet again, but the kind of quiet that came after a warning shot. Because now it wasn't just about an HOA gone rogue. It was about the question no one wanted to say out loud. Who was powerful enough to forge the law itself? Forensics hit like a verdict when the lab confirmed the order was fake. The ink layered, the pressure uniform, the signature lifted from a real ruling and pasted into a lie. So who had the power to forge law and expect no one to notice? The county clerk cracked first when the sheriff walked in with the serial numbers from the citation books and asked a simple question about chain of custody. Because real authority doesn't shout, it asks and waits, and the clerk's eyes told the story before his mouth did, didn't they? The clerk's confession pulled a thread that had been woven into dues, liens, and late-night edits. A thread that led to the consultant with the gray suit and the steady grin, the same face from a failed contract overseas, the same man funding a shell that bought foreclosed homes under market with money that didn't smell like landscaping or playgrounds. So how many porches had he planned to purchase with other people's heartbreak? Bank wires traced through a dead shopping plaza office, signatures stacked like dominoes, and inside the HOA safe lay the missing citation books plus a ledger that read like a grocery list of pain. Each address paired with a fine, each fine paired with a threat, each threat ending in a sale, and every sale kicked a reward back to the board as if trust was a commodity to be flipped on a quiet Tuesday. So when did neighbor turn into predator? Evan stood in uniform without a magazine, palms open, and told the truth in front of everyone. A son speaking like he hoped his mother might hear him through the static, explaining debt and promises, and the moment right now where he chose to stop being a blade for hire. And the crowd listened because confession is also courage. So could redemption be immediate if a man lays down the wrong tool? Luis held his boy and heard the sheriff read charges that actually meant something. Impersonation of an officer, possession of stolen government materials, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and the captain finally lost the grin in the rear seat of a cruiser that didn't belong to him. So how many lives fit into 3 lines on a charging sheet? Keegan stepped closer, cane steady, reciting case law from memory like a hymn. And he thanked the street for showing up with cameras instead of fists, because witnesses are a shield when paperwork becomes a weapon. And he asked a simple thing that sounded old-fashioned and brand new at once: to guard signatures like souls, to ask to see the stamp, to question the stamp, to never let a stamp be the last word. And who knew a retired judge could spark a neighborhood the way a match sparks a lantern? Mia uploaded the drone footage and the porch cam angles with timestamps and serials on screen, not to humiliate, but to protect. And within minutes, the story traveled farther than the cul-de-sac, comments stacking like sandbags against the flood of doubt. So when truth goes online and everyone can see it, how fast does fear lose its footing? He didn't posture or parade. He moved through the chaos like a man putting a puzzle back into its box, returning pieces to their true places, the cuffs that didn't hold, the move that pinned without bruising, the calm that made violence look childish. And when the sheriff walked past the cruiser door, he leaned to the captain and said the unit name in a voice smaller than a whisper. And the captain understood why the quiet never needed to raise its volume. So what do you call authority that doesn't need a megaphone? The state investigator arrived with sealed evidence bags and questions that sounded like statements, and the chairwoman wilted under the weight of her own documents, her signature more dangerous than any baton, her smile finally gone. And in the end, paperwork saved the day because paperwork had been the crime, which is why the safest weapon in the street belonged to the person holding the pen. Isn't that the strangest kind of justice? Consequences arrived fast enough to feel honest. Liens dissolved, predatory fees refunded, the shell company placed under a light it could not survive, and families who had slept in fear exhaled a breath they didn't know they were holding. So when safety returns, does it arrive with a sound or a silence? Luis watched the county void his fines and thanked no one loudly, because gratitude can't compete with relief, and he promised his son a Saturday of bike tires and greasy hands instead of paperwork and panic. And the boy finally looked at his driveway like it belonged to them again. And how many small moments rebuild a house into a home? Evans signed a statement and then asked if he could fix the porch lights he had once photographed for citations. And by the week's end, his ladder leaned against railings he used to fear, refusing money from widows and charging only smiles from men too proud to admit they were tired. So can penance be measured in lumens when the night had been so long? Mia's grandmother stayed in her chair with the oxygen steady and called the drone her angel, laughing until she cried and telling Mia to film everything forever because the world behaves better when watched. And a lot of people online said the same. So is the new neighborhood watch a lens held steady by a teenager who refuses to look away? Mid-street, he spoke not like a commander but like a neighbor with a history, and he asked everyone who had ever been ground under a rulebook to leave a mark right now. A like for the families who fought back, a share for any street that needs proof, a comment with the city they're watching from so help can find them faster than trouble does. Because the only way to beat a fake badge is with a real community that refuses to blink. And isn't that the kind of CTA that becomes a promise? The captain tried one last angle, muttering that bigger men would step out from darker places once the ledgers hit daylight. But the sheriff answered with chain of custody and state prosecutors and an evidence list long enough to make threats sound like static. And in the cruiser window, the captain saw something he had not counted on, his own face reflected back with nothing behind it. So what is a wolf without a pack that believes? He walked home with his sister, and the dog finally exhaled the bark it had been holding for hours, curling at his boots as if the house itself had a heartbeat again. And his sister said nothing because some victories asked for quiet. And he allowed himself one smile that reached only halfway, because unfinished things still waited. And how rare is a win that doesn't taste like smoke? Days later, the mailbox held a small padded envelope with no return, light enough to float and heavy enough to sink a week. Inside, a hard drive and a card with 11 words written in a hand he recognized from an after-action report years ago. You won the street. Do you want the city next? And whose hand writes an invitation like that without forgetting what the answer costs? He turned the drive in his palm and pictured maps unfolding, districts with boards and seals and signatures no one checks, ledgers humming in the dark like quiet engines. And he saw Mia's drone tracing new skies and Evan's ladder leaning on new porches and Luis teaching his boy how to stand tall without raising a fist. And he wondered if the city was ready for a neighborhood that had learned to read its own paperwork. So does courage scale, or does it evaporate past the end of the block? He set the drive down and looked at the street that had chosen to stay. Judge Keegan on a folding chair teaching neighbors how to verify documents. The sheriff scheduling monthly open hours on the corner. The board replaced by real people with names and daytime jobs. And a watch built on sunlight instead of shadows. So is this what repair looks like when it's done by hands that shake but don't stop? The dog slept through the night for the first time since the first letter arrived. And the porch light stayed on by choice, not fear. A small circle of gold that said welcome instead of beware. And he felt the weight of his past settle in a place that didn't ache. Not because the past vanished, but because the present finally had walls strong enough to hold it. And isn't that the quiet ending every loud battle hopes for? He picked up the drive again and faced the camera Mia had left running, not to posture, not to recruit, but to ask a question that didn't belong to one street anymore. To ask anyone still watching to press like if the story hit where it hurts and heals, to share it if a neighbor needs a shield, to tell the comments where they're watching from so the next map draws itself in names and not lines. Because if a cul-de-sac can stand up to a counterfeit crown, what could a city do with a million porch lights and a single truth? He slid the drive into his pocket and let the moment hang just long enough to feel like a decision. Then he turned toward the door with a nod that meant not yet, and soon in the same breath. And as the screen faded, the final words landed like a promise rather than a plea. Like and subscribe so this never gets buried. Tell us your city so help knows where to run. And if the city is next, will you stand on your porch with us when the knock comes?